I knew something was wrong the moment my phone buzzed at 11:47 p.m. It wasn't a random motion alert or a glitchy notification like I usually ignored. This one showed a live image from the backyard camera, and the angle was unmistakable. A woman was standing at the entrance to my root cellar, shining a flashlight straight down into it like she owned the place. She moved confidently, not like someone lost or scared, but like someone checking a box on a list. Then I recognized her. It was the HOA president, the same Karen who had fined me over fence paint, mailbox height, and unapproved landscaping rocks. My stomach dropped as I watched her crouch, pull out a clipboard, and start taking photos. She unlocked the cellar door using something metallic. Not a key. A pry tool. That's when anger replaced disbelief. I slipped on my jacket and stepped outside quietly, staying out of the camera's view. The root cellar sat half buried into the hill, old stone steps leading down into the earth. From where I stood, I could hear her muttering about violations and inspections, complaining that homeowners never learn. She sounded irritated, not afraid, like this was routine for her. I waited until she was fully inside. When I spoke, my voice was calm, but it echoed sharply down the steps. "You lost." She screamed and dropped the flashlight, then immediately snapped into defense mode. She demanded to know why I was sneaking around my own property. She claimed HOA authority, emergency inspection rights, and safety concerns, all without missing a breath. I told her she was trespassing. She laughed and said the HOA gave her jurisdiction anywhere she needed it. That was the moment I decided I was done arguing. I stepped back, lifted the heavy cellar door, and shut it firmly. The sound of metal hitting metal echoed through the ground. I slid the steel bar into place and locked it. The shouting started instantly. Threats. Screaming. Promises to ruin me financially. I didn't respond. I simply pulled out my phone and called the police, reporting an intruder caught on my property. As I waited, I stood above the cellar listening to her rant echo beneath my feet, documenting every word. She was furious, trapped by her own entitlement. For the first time, the power she'd abused had nowhere to go. And I knew when the police arrived, this wouldn't go the way she expected. The dispatcher stayed calm as I explained what was happening, asking clear questions while the noise from the cellar grew louder. Karen's voice echoed up through the ground, bouncing off stone and dirt, carrying every insult she could think of. She demanded I open the door immediately, claiming I was committing a crime by detaining her. I corrected her through the door, slowly and clearly, that she was free to leave the moment police arrived. Until then, my property would remain secured. That only made her angrier. She began pounding on the door with both fists, then switched tactics, raising her voice to sound distressed. She shouted that she was injured, that she was claustrophobic, that she needed medical attention. I stayed silent and let my phone record everything. Years of dealing with her had taught me one thing: she changed stories when pressure didn't work. She suddenly tried to sound friendly, calling my name like we were neighbors chatting over a fence. She said this was all a misunderstanding and suggested we handle it internally before it became embarrassing. When that failed, she threatened to fine me daily, lien my house, and have the HOA lawyer destroy me. Every word dug her deeper. The dispatcher informed me officers were en route. I leaned against the cellar door, feeling the vibrations of her footsteps as she paced below. At one point, she claimed the HOA bylaws gave her emergency authority to inspect underground structures. I almost laughed. I'd memorized those bylaws years ago. Emergency authority didn't include breaking locks at midnight. Her phone rang inside the cellar. She answered loudly, putting it on speaker without hesitation. It was another HOA board member. Karen immediately lied, claiming I had tricked her into the cellar and locked her in. I spoke clearly through the door, stating my name, address, and that police were already responding to a reported trespass. The call ended abruptly. Minutes later, red and blue lights flashed across my backyard fence. Two officers approached cautiously, scanning the area. I explained everything: how I received the alert, recognized her, and secured the cellar after discovering her inside. I showed them the live camera footage, the damaged lock, and the ongoing audio recording from my phone. One officer nodded slowly, clearly unimpressed. The other asked a simple question. "Does she have permission to be on your property?" Before I could answer, Karen screamed from below that she was authorized and that I was lying. The officer exchanged a look with his partner, then instructed me to unlock the door. As the steel bar slid free, Karen prepared herself, already rehearsing her outrage. She had no idea what was about to happen next. The cellar door opened slowly, and Karen charged up the stone steps like she'd been rehearsing for a courtroom drama. She pointed at me immediately, shouting that I had illegally imprisoned her, that she feared for her life, that this entire situation would cost me everything I owned. The officers let her speak without interruption. They had the patience of people who had seen this routine before. When she finally paused to catch her breath, one officer asked her to step aside. She refused, insisting she was the victim and demanding to press charges on the spot. The second officer calmly asked again, this time firmer. Reluctantly, she complied, still muttering about lawsuits and board authority. The officer turned to me and asked for my side again, this time on record. I explained step-by-step: motion alert, camera footage, recognition, discovery of forced entry, and securing my property before calling police. I handed over my phone and showed them the live feed, the earlier recordings, and the damage to the lock. The officers watched quietly, rewinding certain parts, listening closely to her own words echoing from below ground. Karen interrupted repeatedly, correcting details, adding new accusations, changing timelines. Each interruption only made things worse for her. One officer asked her a direct question. "Do you have written permission, a warrant, or an emergency order to enter this property?" She hesitated. Then she said the HOA bylaws gave her authority to inspect for safety concerns. The officer asked to see the bylaw section. She flipped through her papers, growing more frantic by the second. What she found were inspection forms already filled out, time-stamped before she ever entered the cellar. That detail didn't go unnoticed. The officer's tone changed. "Ma'am, you are aware this is private property, correct?" She snapped back that HOAs controlled everything within the neighborhood. The officer shook his head. "That's not how it works." When they asked why she'd brought a pry tool, Karen claimed it was for emergency access. That explanation collapsed the moment I showed footage of her testing the lock first, then forcing it. The officers stepped away briefly, conferring quietly. When they returned, one of them asked me a single question. "Do you wish to press charges for trespassing?" "Yes," I said, without hesitation. Karen laughed nervously, clearly assuming it was a bluff. That laugh vanished when the officer informed her she was being detained pending investigation. She protested loudly, accusing them of siding with me. When she tried to step away, they placed her in handcuffs. The sound of metal clicking shut echoed louder than anything she'd said all night. For the first time, Karen was silent. The patrol car doors closed with a dull thud, and the backyard suddenly felt too quiet. The officers stood with me for a few minutes, explaining what would happen next while Karen sat in the back seat, staring straight ahead, jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. She tried to shout once more as they pulled away, but the sound faded quickly down the road, swallowed by the night. One officer handed me a card with a case number and advised me to preserve all footage, recordings, and HOA correspondence. He also suggested I contact an attorney, given the clear abuse of authority. His tone wasn't dramatic or sympathetic, it was professional, almost routine, which somehow made the whole thing feel even more real. Before leaving, he looked at the cellar door and nodded. "You did the right thing, he said simply. By morning, the neighborhood knew. Someone had posted photos of the police car in the HOA group chat. Messages poured in, some shocked, some defensive, some quietly supportive. A few people insisted Karen had been protecting the community. Others asked questions they'd never dared ask before. Why were inspections happening at night? Why were locks being broken? Why did fines always seem to target the same houses? I contacted a lawyer later that day. After reviewing the footage and HOA bylaws, he told me Karen's situation was serious. Trespassing was clear. The forced entry made it worse. Her position as HOA president didn't protect her, it exposed her. Abuse of authority carried consequences, and the evidence was unusually clean. 2 days later, a temporary restraining order was issued. Karen was legally barred from coming within 500 feet of my property. Holding that document felt surreal. For years, she had walked my neighborhood with absolute confidence, backed by clipboards and threats. Now the law had drawn a boundary she couldn't cross. The HOA board called an emergency meeting that same evening. I didn't attend, but the details traveled fast. Karen was suspended pending investigation. Board members argued, distanced themselves, and suddenly claimed ignorance. The word liability was used more than community. That night, I locked the cellar again and stood there longer than necessary, listening to the quiet. No shouting. No flashlight beams. Just cool air and stone. I realized something had shifted, not just for me, but for everyone who had ever felt bullied into silence. Karen's authority had collapsed the moment she crossed my property line. And the fallout was just beginning. The legal wheels turned quickly after that, faster than I expected. Within a week, my attorney received discovery requests from Karen's lawyer, followed by notices from the HOA's insurance carrier. They wanted statements, timelines, copies of everything. The footage spoke louder than any words, but I cooperated fully, answering questions and providing documentation that stretched back years. Every fine, every warning letter, every inspection notice went into a growing folder that told a very clear story. Depositions were scheduled. Karen's attorney tried to paint her actions as overzealous but well-intentioned, arguing that safety concerns justified quick action. That argument fell apart the moment the pry tool appeared on screen. It collapsed completely when timestamps showed she had prepared violation forms before ever entering the cellar. Intent matters, my attorney reminded me. And intent was written all over the evidence. Meanwhile, the HOA scrambled. 2 board members resigned for personal reasons. Another sent a carefully worded email claiming Karen had acted alone, without authorization. That email didn't help them. Messages obtained during discovery showed those same members had encouraged strict enforcement and praised her for being tough. The distance they tried to create came too late. At the civil hearing, the judge listened quietly as clips played on a large screen. Karen's voice echoed through the courtroom, sharp and entitled, threatening fines and lawsuits from below ground. When it was her turn to speak, she tried to explain that she believed the cellar posed a community risk. The judge asked why no notice had been given, why no warrant had been sought, and why the inspection occurred near midnight. Karen had no clear answers. The preliminary ruling favored me. Trespass was established. Abuse of authority was recognized. The judge issued an expanded restraining order and warned that further violations would carry penalties. A full trial was scheduled if no settlement was reached. Outside the courthouse, neighbors approached quietly, thanking me for standing up. Several admitted they'd been fined or threatened in similar ways but were too afraid to push back. Hearing that confirmed what I'd suspected all along: this wasn't about one cellar. It was about a pattern. Back home, life slowed again. The cameras stayed up, but I checked them less. The cellar returned to what it had always been: shelves, jars, cool air, quiet. The fear that once clung to the place was gone. I hadn't sought revenge. I'd sought accountability. And for the first time, it was working. By the time the full trial date was set, the HOA no longer resembled the organization it once was. An outside management company had taken over operations, and every decision now went through lawyers. Surprise inspections stopped completely. Violation notices were rewritten, toned down, and required photographic proof. It was obvious the board was trying to contain damage, not just from Karen's case, but from what might follow if more homeowners spoke up. Karen, meanwhile, grew quieter. Her attorney filed several motions to dismiss or limit evidence, but most were denied. The judge allowed footage, audio recordings, and prior HOA correspondence to be admitted, citing a clear pattern of behavior. Each ruling stripped away another layer of protection Karen had once relied on. Without her title, she looked smaller, less confident, like someone realizing too late that authority had been borrowed, not owned. The trial itself lasted 3 days. I testified on the first day, sticking strictly to facts. Dates, times, actions. I described the alert, the camera footage, the forced lock, and the decision to secure my property and call police. I didn't exaggerate or editorialize. I didn't need to. The evidence filled in the emotional gaps better than any words could. 2 other homeowners testified next. Their stories were different in detail but identical in tone: unannounced inspections, threats of fines, intimidation masked as community standards. One described Karen entering his backyard without notice. Another explained how she'd threatened legal action over a shed that predated the HOA itself. The pattern became impossible to ignore. When Karen took the stand, she tried to appear reasonable. She spoke about safety, responsibility, and leadership. But under cross-examination, contradictions piled up quickly. She admitted she hadn't notified me before entering my property. She admitted she knew the cellar was locked. She admitted she carried inspection forms with her before seeing the space. Each admission tightened the case. The judge asked one final question. Why did you believe you could do this at night, without permission? Karen hesitated too long. The ruling came the following morning. Karen was found liable for trespass, harassment, and abuse of authority. A permanent restraining order was issued. She was barred from holding any HOA position in the state for 10 years. Damages and legal fees were awarded, and the HOA was ordered to revise its bylaws under independent oversight. When the gavel fell, Karen didn't look angry. She looked defeated. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked if I felt vindicated. I told them this wasn't about winning. It was about boundaries. And those boundaries were finally enforced. The weeks after the verdict felt unusually calm, like the neighborhood itself was relearning how to breathe. For years, tension had hung over every interaction, every trimmed hedge, every parked car, every minor change felt like an invitation for punishment. Now, that constant pressure was gone. Notices still came from the HOA, but they were careful, formal, and rare. No threats. No intimidation. Just information. Karen's house went up for sale quietly. There was no announcement, no farewell message, no dramatic exit. One morning, a for sale sign appeared. A month later, it was gone. Neighbors speculated, but no one seemed surprised. When authority collapses, it rarely does so loudly. It just fades until it's no longer welcome. The HOA held new elections under supervision. I attended the meeting, sitting in the back, listening. The candidates spoke about transparency, limits, and respect. Words I hadn't heard associated with the HOA in years. When one of them openly acknowledged past mistakes and apologized to residents who had been mistreated, the room went silent. Then someone clapped. Slowly, others joined. I didn't run for a position. I had no interest in replacing one form of power with another. What I wanted had already been achieved. The rules were finally being applied the way they were meant to be, equally, openly, and with accountability. A neighbor stopped by one evening while I was checking the cellar lock, more out of habit than necessity. He told me he'd lived under HOAs for decades and had never once felt they worked for homeowners until now. He said seeing someone calmly stand their ground and let the law handle things changed how people viewed authority. That stayed with me. The cellar itself became just a cellar again. Shelves of jars. Cool air. Quiet. No voices echoing through stone. No flashlight beams cutting through darkness. I realized how much fear I'd attached to that space without even noticing. Fear has a way of spreading until it feels normal. I still keep the cameras running. Not because I expect trouble, but because preparation isn't paranoia, it's awareness. Knowing your rights, documenting everything, and staying calm under pressure had done more than anger ever could. Every so often, someone new to the neighborhood asks about the cellar incident. I don't dramatize it. I explain what happened, what I did, and why I let the police handle it. The lesson isn't about trapping someone. It's about boundaries. That night wasn't about revenge. It was about drawing a line and holding it. A full year passed before I truly understood how much that night had changed things. At first, the improvements felt procedural: new bylaws, new faces, fewer notices. But over time, the difference became personal. Neighbors talked to each other again. Disagreements were handled with conversations instead of threats. The HOA existed, but it no longer dominated daily life. It felt like a tool, not a weapon. The revised bylaws were mailed to every homeowner for review. I read them carefully. Inspection authority was limited, notice requirements were clear, and any entry onto private property without written consent was explicitly forbidden. Violations required documented proof and an appeal process with real timelines. Transparency had replaced intimidation, line by line. When the final vote passed, the room didn't erupt in cheers. It didn't need to. Relief was enough. I was asked more than once why I hadn't run for a board position. The truth was simple. I didn't want control. I wanted fairness. Those aren't the same thing, and confusing them is how people like Karen thrive. Fairness works best when no single person gets to decide how far authority can stretch. Karen's name came up less and less. When it did, it was usually as a reminder. Remember when inspections happened at night, someone would say, shaking their head. People spoke more openly about what they'd endured: threatening emails, selective enforcement, sudden fines that appeared without warning. The common thread was silence. Everyone had assumed they were alone. One afternoon, my attorney forwarded me a letter from the State HOA Oversight Board. They thanked me for cooperation and informed me that the case had been referenced during new compliance training. The root cellar incident, as they called it, was now an example of what unchecked authority looks like when it crosses into illegality. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, not as a trophy, but as closure. Life settled into routine again. Seasons changed. The cellar filled and emptied as it always had. Sometimes, standing at the top of the stone steps, I remembered the echo of her voice shouting from below, the weight of the door in my hands. It reminded me how quickly a small decision can ripple outward. Rules didn't change the neighborhood. People did once they realized they could. The anniversary of that night arrived without warning. I only noticed because my phone surfaced an old camera clip, automatically labeled by date. I watched it once, then closed it. I didn't need to hear the shouting again or see the frantic movement underground. The memory had changed shape over time. What once felt tense and surreal now felt steady, like a line drawn clearly and held. The neighborhood had settled into something healthier. Kids rode bikes without parents worrying about rule violations. People worked on their yards without measuring tape anxiety. The HOA still functioned, but quietly, predictably, the way it should have from the beginning. Authority no longer hovered. It served. At the annual HOA meeting, the new president asked if I'd say a few words. I agreed, not to retell the story, but to explain process. I talked about documentation, about knowing bylaws, about staying calm and letting the law do its job. I emphasized that no one wins when power is abused, but everyone benefits when boundaries are respected. The room stayed quiet, attentive. That mattered more than applause. After the meeting, several homeowners approached me. One older woman said she'd lived under HOAs her entire adult life and had never once felt protected by them until now. Another said the Cellar incident gave people courage to speak instead of whisper. Hearing that confirmed something I hadn't fully realized before. Standing your ground doesn't just protect you. It shows others they're allowed to do the same. Karen never reached out again. According to my attorney, she moved out of state and no longer had any involvement with HOAs. I didn't feel satisfaction in that. What I felt was relief that her influence had ended. Some people misuse authority because no one ever stops them. Stopping them doesn't require cruelty. It requires resolve. The root cellar remains what it was always meant to be. Cool. Quiet. Ordinary. Sometimes I stand at the door and think about how a place so simple became a turning point. Not because of what was inside it, but because of what happened when someone crossed a line and expected no consequences. That night, I didn't act out of anger. I acted out of clarity. I secured my property, documented everything, and let the police handle it. I trusted the process, even when it felt uncomfortable. Closing that door didn't trap someone unfairly. It opened accountability. And that changed everything.